couple of questions. So one at the back there, and one here.
I just wanted to pick up the point Julia made really and expand it a little bit. I'd be interested in your thoughts. Liz Bickerton, I don't belong to any organisation. I'm a freelance researcher, which is quite useful in these circumstances. I wanted the panel to expand a bit more about this idea about the whole tenor of the discussion so far has been about that we are operating in somebody else's rules. They don't turn up to our meetings. They don't provide us with the right evidence for our needs. The title of this evening is about a new social contract. And I just want to know, in a Wales context, which we haven't heard a great deal about tonight, within a Welsh context, how we create space where we don't have one other model that would be suitable to them, but we have a new way of doing things. So some reflection on that would be useful, I think.
I'm Fran Target from Citizens Advice Cymru. And there's a few things I want to pick up. First one is really the whole issue of truth to power, which I mean is so fundamental to what we as an organisation try to do, is both actually be a service deliverer, but also use that, however uncomfortable that might be to the people who are our paymasters, don't care, we will speak truth to power on behalf of our clients. And I think to say that the voluntary sector doesn't, has ceased to do that, is missing actually a huge amount that's going on. I think it's been quite interesting listening to you all talk about the voluntary sector, suggesting that it's sort of homogeneous, and it isn't. We all do all sorts of different and interesting things in different and interesting ways, and we need to be a bit careful about that. But I think the bit that I would be interested in your views on is that there seems to me to be a current discourse in the media, sometimes around our own discussion tables, which is about driving people apart. It's about the poor versus the rich. It's about scroungers versus the strivers, the young people versus the old people, business versus communities. And I don't see any of those as oppositional, and yet actually they're talked about as if they are. And I think, if we're talking about a new social contract, that's some of the places we ought to be starting. And something about the relationships bit between community, state, the voluntary sector, the business markets. Actually, if we're not all actually pushing this together, I think, to expect one sector to have a big idea, actually it's something we need to do together. And I suppose I'm a bit sad. I still think that equality and equity is a big idea and is worth pursuing. It's not like we have to stop doing and stop pursuing the things that we always believed in.
One more comment.
Katrina Williams from Children in Wales, also the Commissioner on the UK Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission. Actually, Fran said one of the things I was going to say, particularly about partnership between all the different players, because we've got in-work poverty as well as out-of-work poverty, although in Wales we've got more out-of-work poverty, but we haven't got jobs. And so the connection across between the different players, we've got to have a good economy. But I think we'd have to be pushing it together, and I'd be interested around the intergenerational issues, because we have actually now got a generation of young people who will be worse off than their parents were. So how as a society do we push together to not let that happen? They've got less opportunity to have homes of their own, and those sorts of issues need to have a wider debate. And I think I'd be interested in your comments. I could talk to you about the Family Nurse Partnership, which I'm not as struck on as perhaps you are, but the sort of Wales issues and how we might actually work very productively with the private sector, because we're so public sector dependent for our young people to have jobs in the future. How do we, as a sector, or perhaps with ideas that you can give us, get much more self-esteem into our young people because of looking towards the future. And finally, politics. Nobody's mentioned politics. There's lots of big ideas, there's lots of things that are evidence-based that could be brought up to scale from the third sector that have been researched wherever. But actually, the 4-year time frame of politics doesn't actually allow for babies to achieve their full well-being when they're older. So how do we together address that?
Right, there's some big issues in there. I'm going to tackle the one we're probably least qualified to answer first, which is about Wales. I know, London, Liverpool, York, Dunfermline. Yes. The point for all of this is this. From all our experience, asking you, in this increasingly diversified United Kingdom, where going in different ways, what is it that we should be doing? Should we be looking across the United Kingdom? Should we be looking elsewhere? Should we be? Is there things to learn from each other? And what can you add to that kind of Welsh dimension? Is there something in Wales that you would pick out particularly good or particularly poor?
Oh, I'll have a go because you caught my eye. I deliberately didn't talk about Wales because I'm very conscious that I'm not from Wales, but I do lead a foundation that has tried very hard to have an understanding of the four nations, and that's not just because it's interesting, although it is very interesting, but it's because part of our view about where social change happens is in understanding how other places do things. In the 8 years I've been in this role, all I've seen is more difference between the four nations of the UK and more devolution with a very small d everywhere else. I think the local is where it's going to be, and I think the governance of smaller countries like Wales is incredibly important and interesting for others to learn from. One of the saddest things I've witnessed is not Wales so much, but other countries like Scotland looking elsewhere all over Europe for their thinking, ideas, evidence, rather than looking within the four nations of the UK, because I think there is so much learning that can work across. When that's good, it can be transformative. In terms of what's happening in Wales, and forgive me for knowing very little about this, but I think the work that's been done on sustainability and future generations is a really interesting model. I haven't seen it happen elsewhere. And I think it goes to the question of politics, which is trying to create, it's probably imperfect, and you all know the things that don't work with it, but it is an imperfect but clever way of trying to deal with the short-term political cycle. In a democracy we have to have, we can't wish that away. But on some things we need more long-term. And the reason JRF has launched its big approach, like what would a UK without poverty look like, is because we believe we can't do that. We don't have some shared understanding between political parties. All of the big public policy gains we've made in this country, across the UK, have been because it's taken longer than 4 years to do anything. And we need to have that on a whole range of other things, which is not wishing away political. In many ways, I think political difference is how we articulate power, but it is about saying, on some things, we will commit ourselves to going further for longer.
Okay, so, I mean, again, we're based in London, but we do venture out. I was in Swansea last week. We're helping Swansea, who are one of the European healthy cities, to think through their early years strategy. And I think, I mean, we looked at the evidence in advance. We've got health inequalities in the UK, we've got health inequalities in Wales, we've got issues to do with child development in the UK, we've got issues to do with child development in Wales, and the social gradient is pretty similar. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from each country. And just to give you one of the things that happened at that event, there was a head teacher stand up and say, talking about the kind of level of deprivation in her school, that lots of the children didn't come to school with much of the knowledge of food, and they were doing a tasting session, and it was to do with apples, and you just think, oh gosh, it's really striking. How going to different communities and hearing about poverty in those communities can impact you. But we hear similar stories across the UK too. And so, I mean, I think that there are things that we can learn from each other. I'm sure that there are different systems in Wales, and I wouldn't presume to be able to say exactly what the mechanisms are by which you want to go about them, but I think that we can share the same goals and learn from some of the same examples in how to tackle some of these issues.
Thank you. I'm just going to go back and Fran's question about the voluntary sector not being homogeneous. And it's very important to have a quick look at that. The voluntary sector is broadly a very small number of very large organisations, a very large number of very tiny organisations, a huge long tail of organisations, most of which don't have any staff, very insecure funding. Can we just have a conversation, something about this, reflecting back to Fran, that view? You are a very large organisation, of course. But you know, this is not homogeneous. It's quite right to point that out to us. Comment?
Nor is any other sector. I think we just have to come to terms with this. It's a way of grouping a vast number of different organisations who have a social purpose. And it can be as different as, is it a charity that runs the Millennium Centre? It isn't, it is in most cities. Down to tiny grassroots organisations which don't have any staff and will never have any staff. And I think we have to understand that that's true of all sectors. We need to not overclaim what that sector stands for. What we need to do is recognise the values that it has got and its capacity. And I think it's its potential, not its reputation, that I'm really interested in. So I try, although I can be fair on this today, not to generalise about it, but to say there are strengths that we have because we're independent, and that's shared whether you're running a massive organisation or a tiny one. And we set our own course, which, to go back to Liz's question, I think is the really critical bit of this. I feel incredibly strongly that the organisations with which I have often worked, called the sector or not, have been lulled into a sense that other people are setting the course. And actually what matters is we set our own courses, because that's what's our unique ability we need to achieve.
Yes, I mean, I don't regret that some voluntary organisations are extremely large, and in fact that, you know, very often now the main sort of like deliverer of services, and they get, you know, although even they very often, you know, subject to the vagaries of contracts, etc. But they get, you know, 1 year contract probably in perpetuity, you know. And I don't have a problem with that. I think it actually strengthens probably their stance vis-a-vis the government, local government and others. And because I have my doubts about the partnership model, to be honest. The evidence shows in England as well as in Wales, and that's also studies I've done myself, that the partnership isn't really equal, or is rarely equal. It's very stark asymmetry in those partnerships at work. But coming just back to one moment to this question of evidence and Wales, you probably noticed that from Germany, and you know, I was born in Germany, and we have a federal system, and you're moving into something like a federal system with devolution. And the biggest regret I have is that so far, when I look at health, and look at studies, King's Fund and others, they're comparing health outcomes, health data, and I do this myself as well. It's becoming more and more difficult to initialize shared learning. It's actually harder to learn now because we have so disparate systems and we're moving away from each other. And also, quite frankly, because England is quite dominant. You know, I mean, it's just a natural sort of like problem, really. But that's probably a real regret that we don't really have that sort of like level of shared learning. You know, we should learn far more from each other.
So we've got another couple of questions, I think.
One there and one right here.
Hi, Doug Williams from the Wales Audit Office. I'm just intrigued with the title for Time for a New Social Contract. In Wales, local government reorganisation is kind of happening. And I'm intrigued as to what, well, the Auditor General has asked a question in a speech for, in the WRGA conference about what's the role of local government in Wales, and you know, where's the discussion about that. And I'm kind of intrigued really in what the panel's opinions are on that, and actually how that might relate to the new social contract that we're talking about.
Thank you very much. One at the back.
Ujunava Thomas from the Welsh Government. I'd be quite interested to hear what the panel's views are about involving young people, because I don't see many young people in the sort of places that I go to where we're talking about the new contract or discussions about what is essentially their future. And it worries me because I think they live in almost like a different world to us at times, and they're in a sort of both a local and a global world. We don't seem to connect the two very much in terms of where everything seems to be. And the second bit of the question was about the role of academic institutions. It feels like there's a big sort of divide between what the academic institutions can offer and what the third sector needs. And I wonder if there's any sort of bridging that we can suggest.
Okay, that's a big question. So we're going to try, I'm not sure I fully followed your challenge to us, but maybe the panel did definitely.
Well, the purpose of local government.
Well, if that's what it was, okay then.
Big question. I mean, I said rather bravely, and I'm going to say it again, that the only reason to do any sort of reorganisation, restructuring, new social contract is if you think by that you can improve outcomes for people. And I think that's true. I think we face huge financial pressures, all that stuff that everybody knows, but actually the test has to be, will this do things better in the end? And I think that has to be the challenge for local government reorganisation. Will it do for people who are living impoverished lives a better job than what you've had before? My understanding is that that's part of the thinking about it, that it really matters. But I want to pick up the point about young people. I think the challenge is a really good one. The voluntary sector will have lost its way if the next generation is not picking up some of the messages that we're doing and changing what we do. For me, it's not about transmission. We shouldn't be telling them. We need to be listening much more acutely. And I'm very conscious that we have to work quite hard to do that, because the difference between generations in terms of learning and communication is probably as great as it's ever been. The old model, to go back to my thing about not just pricing it on, won't do. We can't just train people up. We need to be trained by younger people. I speak as someone who only learned to tweet because of an intern in my organisation. I never would have done it otherwise.
I think I completely agree if this is what you hinted at with the local government. I mean, compared to Spain, Germany, Netherlands, Austria, all these countries, this local government is a largely emasculated force. It's a very, very weak force. And if we wanted to strengthen communities and individuals and wanted to improve delivery as well, service delivery, we need to give them far more powers than they have at the moment, the local government. Local authorities, a start would be, the coming together of the Manchester Council, the councillors and the council leaders, and the pact, the contract they signed with Judge Osborne just recently about transport, etc. So that's really something like a blueprint. It should be a blueprint for the rest. Interesting enough, in Wales we have a slightly countervailing tendency. What devolution created has been create a bit of a Westminster and Cardiff. It's sort of like sucking up all the energies and away from the councils and making it even worse. And that's on the social services bill recently with Helen Taylor from Cardiff. And it's even there in the bill that ministers intervene directly in local government more and more. So and I don't think that's a good model for governance and for successful governance.
Angela, could you address this point about academic institutions? I think it's relevant to what you were saying. I'd like a little bit more conversation on that disconnect, I think.
Yeah. So I think that academic organisations do a very good job in describing the problem, but not a very good job at helping others to work out what works. And I was talking about this earlier. I think not as part of the debate, but just I think it's because if we're asked to describe what's working, then it doesn't necessarily go into those peer-reviewed journals. So academics aren't incentivised. So I think there's some incentive problems within academia which are driving them not to do policy work or to do necessarily decent evaluations. So I think that could be looked at. I mean, we are an institute attached to an academic organisation. Actually, see ourselves, we're probably third sector, we're kind of a business, we're definitely a charity. We try to take on those kind of consultancies to help organisations work out how to do an evaluation and so forth, but there aren't that many of us in the university, and we're certainly not that welcome.
I think the biggest challenge facing many academic institutions is precisely the one you've described, is how all that amassed knowledge can be put to public use. There's huge pressure on academic institutions to do it, and many are doing very different things. What's called in the jargon, as you'll know better than me, knowledge transfer covers a multitude of sins, and what actually matters is how we make that available for public good. I happen to know, and I shouldn't, that Cardiff University, represented over here, is just doing a lot of work on that. There may be others in Wales which I don't know about, but I do know progressive institutions like that are making that more part of their purpose. Because if they don't, they will come to be seen as very sterile, detached organisations. And just like all the rest of us, legitimacy, connections and networks are really important.
I think we have time for one more round of questions, if there are any energy then. Great. One there, and another yes.
Thank you. I'm Ruth Dinning from Co-Production Wales, so the question won't come as a shock, I think. Back to the big idea. Co-production has been spoken about a great deal in Wales over the last few years, and WCDA has supported this strongly. It's in the Williams Commission, it's in prudent healthcare, it's in the NHS priorities, it's in the Social Services and Wellbeing Bill. It was in the Future Generations Bill until about a week ago, and then a minister took it out again. But we still live in hope. Do you feel that co-production is a big idea to actually make it worthwhile putting our energies into it?
I haven't got a microphone, but anyway, I'm John Palmer from the NHS. Oh, I'll stop shouting. I'm John Palmer from the NHS. Given the extreme of the social gradient that we face, is it a new social contract that we need, or is it a revolution?
Yes. I'm right behind you.
Love the revolution.
Okay, well, as we're being filmed, let's deal with co-production first. Who would like to go on co-production?
Can I start?
Yes.
Do we feel that co-production is the big new idea? No. I think that going back to what somebody else said about tackling inequality, sorting out poverty, I think that we need an outcome as a goal, and that's just one way of achieving it, and I think the evidence is out as to whether or not it's actually going to make that much of a difference anyway.
Julia?
I don't want a big idea. I want lots of things that make life better for people, and I think the search for a big idea is a dangerous one. I think co-production, as you described it to me earlier today, Ruth, I can see as being hugely effective. I've also seen it being done in ways that didn't inspire me at all. So for me, it's a question of me. Co-design is incredibly important. The old notion that we could design a service without involving the service user seems to me idiotic in retrospect, although I bet we've all been involved in doing it. Co-production, I think, if it has at its roots the notion that strong communities are the best place for people to lead good lives, and that more empowered communities can fight better for their common, develop better voices for people, and hold government to account better, that's really interesting. If co-production is just another word for partnership between government and voluntary organisations, I'm not terribly interested. Although I'm sure there should be much more partnership, but I've been doing that for decades. I don't get very excited.
Yeah, I do. Just briefly, I think we just need to look very, very carefully at the small print of what the government actually does with this co-production. And I think, as I said previously, co-production in highly asymmetrical contexts, such as health, is probably just a fig leaf. So we really need to think very, very hard, how do we structure the relationships differently in such a way that we have a genuine, sort of partnership, or a genuine sort of like symmetry of power between the recipients of services and those who actually carry this out, all the state and the voluntary sector, because that applies to all sorts of levels of co-production.
Okay, the revolution question. From the NHS representative, which is interesting.
Unqualified.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think I'm sometimes surprised that there isn't more action and unrest, I guess, about some of the massive inequalities that we have. However, I think if you look at what's happening in every time that people go on strike or that they do demonstrate, there isn't much change. So I believe that people don't necessarily know how to revolt, or we don't know what that revolution would look like. But I do think there's something, I said earlier on about the collective voice of the people. There are 7 million, I think, around 7 million people who are in unions, but that leaves a lot of people who aren't in unions. And there are a lot of marginalised people in fractured communities that I do believe do need a voice. And I go back to the fact that I do believe that we do need some fundamental redistribution of power, money and resources, but I think we need to think about how we get that.
Well, I grew up in East Germany, so I can tell you revolution ain't fun. So it's a tough world. I don't want to have another revolution. I lived it for 20 years, and it's not the nice bit. But I take it was sort of more polemical. And I do actually want to echo what Angela just said. It's actually that the suffering has actually been privatized in a sense in this country, and that's actually that's something we need to come to terms with also in terms of how do we gather support for certain ideas. And that's very, very important, and that's probably the role of the volunteer sector in a certain sense as well.
Well, I've said and written, and JRF and Harriet Nix have said it so many times, that actually we face an enormous risk if we carry on with our existing levels of poverty and inequality. It's bad for us, it's not just bad for them. And I think it risks our social fabric. So I'm like Axel, I'm frightened of revolution, because I think that's where we're headed. But I do think that in order to forestall that, we need really radical revolutionary change. And a number of the things we struggled with for a long time won't just be slowly adapted, we need to be really bold. But that's not the same as the one big idea, because I think some of the really big transformative changes happen quite locally, happen in quite small places. And we often fail to record them because we don't draw attention to what's really going on. We just think, well, that's interesting, let's move on. I think part of our function has to be to say, they're changing things there, let's see what we can learn from, let's see what we can do with it, because I think that's how you get real lasting change.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the panel for all their contributions. I wanted to just show your appreciation.